From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic: prospects for peace in the Middle East.
I'm Peter Hattis. For more than a generation, the people of the Middle East have lived in constant turmoil. 4 wars have been fought since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, and the years in between have been marred by provocations on both sides. Endless border skirmishes and raids, air attacks, terrorist activity. Often, but with little success, United Nations diplomats have addressed themselves to the Middle East problems. American presidents since Truman, Democrats and Republicans, have tried to help by proposing various peace plans. Secretaries of State have tried but failed to develop a completely workable solution. Members of the Senate and House committees that deal with foreign affairs have tried, also unsuccessfully, to come up with the key to a permanent peace settlement for that part of the world. What are this country's concerns in the Middle East? Why is permanent stability in that part of the world so very important? What are some of the economic, strategic, and moral issues involved? Is there any reason to believe that the chances for a lasting peace are better now than before? Or, as many people fear, are those chances in fact worse now? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Today's topic: prospects for peace in the Middle East. Appearing on the panel are Senator Jacob Javits of New York. Mr. Javits, a longtime member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has made several fact-finding visits to Middle Eastern nations. Senator Javits has served as a delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. J. William Fulbright, former senator from Arkansas, now practicing law in Washington. Mr. Fulbright served as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 15 years, the longest such tenure in history. Mr. Fulbright, himself a Rhodes Scholar, authored the international scholarship program which bears his name. George Ball, former Undersecretary of State and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, now a senior partner in a New York investment firm. Mr. Ball spent 33 years in government service, much of it with the State Department. Rita Hauser practices international law with a New York firm. She is a former U.S. representative to the UN Commission on Human Rights and has served as a delegate to the UN General Assembly. She was a member of the Brookings Institution's Middle East Study Group. Our panel moderator is Joseph Sisko, president of the American University in Washington. Mr. Sisko served as a principal advisor and deputy negotiator for Middle Eastern issues during his 25 years at the State Department. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs and also as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Now, here is Mr. Sisko.
Welcome to another program in the series of public policy forums presented by the American Enterprise Institute. We are pleased you could join us for what we expect to be an informative and lively discussion on prospects for peace in the Middle East. The history of the Middle East has been a history of lost opportunities. 1976 has been characterized as a year of opportunity. Is it to be lost? And is the area to return to the vortex of violence and counterviolence that has been so characteristic of this area over the years? There are both positive and negative factors in the situation. The balance of forces in the area, logically, is a deterrent to war, but logic has not always prevailed in the Middle East. Peoples on both sides of the conflict are absolutely sick and tired of war. They are ready to support another peaceful effort. For Israel, there is the lingering disbelief that the Arabs want real peace and coexistence, but rather are seeking not a fundamental strategic change, but a tactical hiatus during which another war can be launched aimed at its extinction. For the Arabs, there is the deeply rooted fear that Israel favors territory over peace, and these fears have been reinforced by the policies of the new Israeli leadership. Yet, both sides have experienced successful negotiations. Both sides are satisfied with the 3 interim agreements that were achieved in recent years. Moreover, an international framework for negotiations exists. In November of 1967, the Security Council adopted a very significant resolution which contains the principal elements of peace. And yet, the chasm of distrust is very, very deep indeed. I'm pleased to be joined by this distinguished panel. Senator Javits, how do you see the prospects in the area at the present time?
I think the prospects have improved lately for 2 reasons. One, that the Begin government can deliver, and this has been a problem with Israel for some time. Mr. Begin seems to have established a position based upon a new election which enables him, in my judgment, if he does work out a peace agreement, to get it approved by the people of Israel and by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Second, I find, and I've just been through the Middle East, an enormous combination of deep war weariness. This is particularly true in Egypt, which is the principal population center of the Arab world, coupled with such grave economic difficulty, which, by the way, extends not just for Egypt, but for Israel as well, as to be a very powerful inducement to endeavor to construct a peace. Finally, I don't believe that this is going to be accomplished in one fell swoop or by some package that will be wrapped up and delivered by President Carter or anybody else. But the process, I believe, we have a pretty good chance now of seeing the process start, which will lead to a stabilization of the situation. In short, I can't promise the moon in the sky, but I do believe that the prospects are better than ever I've seen them before in a long while.
Mr. Fulbright?
Mr. Cisco, the Middle East is today, I think, the most difficult of all foreign policy issues to discuss objectively, candidly, and without rancor in public forums. The deep and powerful emotions inherent in this issue find few, if any, parallels in our history. Today, the firm of Hogan & Hartson, of which I am a member, is registered as a legal representative of the governments of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But the views I express today long antedate that connection and are spoken today not in my professional capacity as a lawyer, but simply as an American citizen concerned primarily, as we all are, with the best interests of the United States. Historical events beyond our control have resulted in the United States being the decisive factor in achieving a solution of the conflict or in perpetuating it. Our role in this matter is fraught with the most serious consequences for good or for evil for all of us. I am concerned that an unprecedented and possibly irretrievable opportunity for peace is slipping through our hands. On the one side, the Arabs have acquired the necessary unity and will and moderation to accept a settlement under which Israel would be assured of a reasonably secure national existence. On the other side, the Begin government, highly nationalistic and motivated by ancient historical claims, as well as considerations of national security, is pursuing a policy which offers little promise of an early general settlement. Prime Minister Begin is able to sustain this policy only because the United States continues to provide the indispensable economic and military means to do so, even though this enables Israel to resist and at times defeat the objectives and national interests of the United States. It is, I believe, an unprecedented situation for any nation. One objective of our national policy is, of course, the preservation of the integrity of Israel, but it is not the only national interest we have in the Middle East. It is the responsibility of President Carter to reconcile these various interests with each other and not to give Israel such absolute priority that it jeopardizes all the other interests. Some of these interests are, for example, one, to minimize or eliminate the Middle East as a source of confrontation with the Soviet Union, to ensure continued access to the energy of the Gulf states, essential to the economic health of Europe and Japan as well as the United States, and three, to support our solemn treaty obligation and the principles of the United Nations Charter and our long-standing policy of support for the principles spelled out in Resolution 242 of November 1967. The essential elements of a reasonable peace settlement are now well known and widely agreed upon by reasonable people of diverse personal sympathies. The problem now is to act upon our own stated objectives. By general agreement, Israel today has clear military superiority in the area. So the former plea that she could make no concessions when weak no longer applies. The premise that military superiority would make Israel flexible has been tested and found wanting. The only other incentive the United States can apply is to place limits upon and, if necessary, reduce our military and economic support. This issue poses a challenge of the highest consequence to our national leadership. The question upon which war or peace depends is whether the President of the United States can muster the strength and determination to pursue a policy which is both equitable to the parties in the Middle East and is solidly based upon the national interests of the United States.
All right, thank you. Mr. Ball?
Obviously, the national interest of the United States is to avoid war in the Middle East. I can't think of anything that would be more destructive than another war and the oil embargo that would inevitably accompany it. This would be a new kind of war. Both sides now have surface-to-surface missiles. It would be a far more destructive war. It would engage the fate of the civilian populations on both sides. From the point of view of the larger world struggle, it would present a very serious danger of a superpower confrontation. Finally, the oil embargo, if it were invoked again, as indeed it would be if there were shooting war, would bring about a disruption of the unity of the non-communist world with costs that are incalculable. Now, how do we bring about peace? What is involved? I do think that the basic outlines of a settlement have been known for some time, in fact, ever since 1967 and the Resolution 242 by the Security Council of the United Nations. What is required is, from the point of view of this country as we see it, a real peace, not merely a declaration of non-belligerency. And I think that the government of Israel is quite right in insisting that there be a real peace. But to have a real peace, there must also be a withdrawal by Israel from the territories taken in 1967. A substantial withdrawal, if not complete one, but one in which the areas for discussion are limited. There must also be some provision made for a homeland for the Palestinians. I think the situation that has prevailed for 10 years is intolerable. I don't think that the United States should go forward in the position of subsidizing a military occupation of more than 1 million people in the West Bank of the Gaza Strip, who were denied any suffrage, any opportunity of self-determination, which is a central element in our policy. So I think we have to face this squarely, and I think we have to insist upon it. And I think, as suggested by Senator Fulbright, we have the means to insist upon it if we will. These are the elements which seem to me to be essential to a settlement, and I think that this is going to be a great testing of the strength and determination that underlies United States foreign policy. I think it's going to be a great test of the President as to whether he has the will to see this through. Because if he doesn't, I'm very, very dubious about what the future may hold. It seems to me that if the conference breaks down or if no conference can be held, that there will almost certainly be an Arab determination to seek a military solution within the 2 or 3 years that's required for a military buildup. And they now have all the money in the world. And that this is going to lead to incalculable consequences, which I don't think in our national interest we dare face.
Mrs. Hauser?
I think the situation is extremely propitious for peace in the Middle East for two fundamental reasons. First, this administration, as well as the preceding one, understands the necessity of America taking a dynamic, front-running, leading role in being the catalyst to bringing both sides to a bargaining table. And both the administrations, Carter in particular now, seems willing to do that. Secondly, and very luckily, the Russian interest seems to coincide with our own. At least for the moment, all indications are that they would cooperate in a peace endeavor and would not impede it. If the United States, in taking the leading role, can understand that a measure of both patience and care is required in getting these people to the bargaining table, and not engage in either the thrust that Mr. Ball advocates very often, that is imposing a solution on the parties, or wrapping up a package and offering it up on the table, as some in this administration have tended to do, but will limit itself to pushing, pulling, tugging, easing the parties to that conference table, I believe, as Senator Javits does, that both sides really want to bargain and want to negotiate a peace, the contours of which are fairly clear and the problems about which could be overcome once a Geneva conference got going. It is the role of the United States to try to get Israel to the conference table, but it's also our role to try to get the Arabs to the conference table. And at the moment, the single impediment in getting them there seems to be the question of PLO representation. I hope very much that the administration is not succumbing to the easy prospect of trying to get the PLO to modify its stand in some way, ambiguous as it may be, and then urging Israel to compromise and come and deal with the PLO. In my view, that's an effort that will fail. It will cause incredible bitterness and may defeat the conference in itself. In the Brookings report, we envisaged a peace process that might last 10, 15, or 20 years. As long as in the place of war there begins a normalization process, people in the area beginning to deal with one another, trade, culture, exchange, building for the next generation, which will ultimately produce the final peace.
Well, I think this panel is all agreed that there is an unusual opportunity this year. I think basically each of the panelists have indicated that the United States role is an important one. There may be differences of view as to what that role might be. What about American support of Israel, as indicated by Mr. Fulbright, Senator Javits? Where does that fit into our overall interests? And do you feel, as he does, that the support of Israel jeopardizes these other interests?
Well, I certainly don't. Senator Fulbright and I have differed on that for almost all the 25 years he's been talking about it. And so far, time has been on my side. The fact is that the United States interests have not been compromised, that we have more influence in the Middle East than we ever had before, that the Soviet Union is pretty well counted out of it in terms of the ability to bring about a peace, and yet the constant cry for 25 years has been force them into it, make them do it. And both of these presentations of Mr. Ball and Senator Fulbright disregard the fundamental fact that as far as Israel is concerned, it doesn't even have to lose only one war, it has to lose only one battle, and it's finished. And the Arab states have enormous resources. Mr. Ball just said that. He said they have all the money in the world. That doesn't happen to be true. As a matter of fact, for Egypt, which is in very serious economic straits, notwithstanding all the money in the world that Saudi Arabia or Kuwait might have. But be that as it may, I do not believe that these force majeure tactics are going to bring about either a peace or a stabilization of the area, or safeguard our interest to bring that area into some kind of living condition in modern terms. But I believe that the example of the democracy of Israel, which has already having a material effect throughout the Arab world, the fact, and Mr. Ball, I don't know where he got his facts, he said they've had no suffrage. In the West Bank, they've just had within the last year elections certified by everybody, including the enemies of Israel, as being completely democratic, notwithstanding the fact that most of the mayors are pro-PLO. It's an unheard of thing, honest elections in the Middle East. And yet that's what's happened on the West Bank. This process has to be given a chance. But the minute that we try these tactics of threat, and you cut off their military support and leave them at the mercy of the worst elements in the Arab world, is the soonest way to bring on war, by giving the Arab illusion that the United States is going to deliver for them what they haven't been able to deliver for themselves in 4 wars.
George Ball.
Well, I would like to amend one statement that was made a moment ago, or at least to point out what seems to me to be a misconstruction of a position. I'm all for the support of Israel. I think the United States should continue to lend its fullest support to Israel. The question for the United States is not whether we support Israel, but what kind of a situation we're prepared to subsidize. This is a matter of American national interest. This is a decision that can't be made in Jerusalem. It has to be made in Washington. Looking at this whole situation from the point of view of the United States, what is the kind of situation that we're prepared to subsidize? Well, certainly not a situation of stalemate that can lead to disaster. Therefore, we should, by all means, use what elements of persuasion we have in order to try to bring about a peace which we regard as, from the point of view of the American national interest as well as from the larger considerations of all of the peoples involved, fair and reasonable, which meets the legitimate interests of all sides. And the point that I'm simply making is that the Palestinians are denied any possibility of self-determination so long as the present situation continues. They're in effect under the colonial domination and the military domination of Israel. And I think that for this to go on for 10 years as it has, is long enough. That this is more than 1 million people, and I would suppose that the colonialism of the kind that we see here is an anachronism.
George, I think it's fair, since you speak of 10 years of a long occupation, to ask why it's endured that long. Israel won a decisive victory in '67. The expectation of everyone, including Israel, was an immediate turn to the conference table, which is normal after war and victory, and the Arab countries 6 months later at Khartoum issued their famous 3 no's. They would not negotiate, they would not recognize, and they would not sign a peace treaty. As a consequence of that, an occupation has endured, which is not the thing that Israel expected, and I would say safely most Israelis would like to see continued. The problem has been throughout, and it must not be obfuscated, that the Arabs refuse to accept the existence of Israel. They have refuted it on each occasion. And finally, we have come to the point where they have exhausted themselves. They know they can't win in the battlefield. So they are trying to get to a Geneva conference, which is fair enough, even though it comes late. Yet they still persist in dragging up this herring, this PLO, which in fact is, in my view, a greater impediment to the Arabs than it is to Israel.
The key question is, on the procedural side, should there be Palestinian representation at a renewed Geneva conference? The Israeli position is that they will not sit down with the PLO. On the other hand, there are proposals that have been put forward by the Israeli government that would include Palestinians from the West Bank. Now, what about this issue of Palestinian representation at Geneva?
I wonder if I could say a word about this other. I'm still on the panel.
You've been very quiet, Bill.
Well, I didn't wish to intervene in this dialogue you had there. There are 2 or 3 things that I certainly don't agree to. This business of force majeure and forcing them to do anything, all I suggest and still do is that it isn't requiring them to do anything, just to cease subsidizing their occupation and their war-making capacity. They make war because we furnish them the means to do it. And they wouldn't do it. I think this is quite different from an imposed peace. They are expecting us to continue to support this effort in occupation, and if they should start a new war, a preemptive war, they would expect us to support that. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And the one danger of this suggestion I've made is that if we should do this, it is quite possible they would start another war, and this would create a great emotional outcome here. And this involves a political situation in this country, which is the greatest danger of all to the president or to doing anything affirmative because of the effect it would have upon the political structure of this country. I spoke as long ago as 1970 that I was willing to both support a bilateral guarantee of of the integrity of both the Israelis and Arab states in the Union, in the area. No one is saying leave anybody at the mercy of anyone. It is to stabilize the area, and I'd be more than willing to enter into agreements in conjunction with the UN Security Council that both sides. The fact is, today Israel, by common consent, I think, is far more powerful militarily because we've given them far more and better weapons than all the Arabs together. And if the military situation is quite satisfactory from their point of view, and of course this makes them feel that they don't have to do anything. And at the moment they wouldn't have to. I think the article Mr. Ball says, How to Save Israel in Spite of Herself, is a very appropriate one. When you have political elected officials, such as they have there and as we have here, it's not uncommon that a man has to, if he feels that it is the interest of his country to take a certain unpalatable decision, he would like someone to blame it on to. And I think the United States, because of its history and its position, is the one who has to take that blame and ought to take that blame. It's in our national interest to relieve the government of Israel from the necessity of voluntarily making an unpalatable decision, such as sitting down with the PLO. The PLO is simply a symbol. It's the more current symbol of the terrorism which Mr. Begin himself originated a few years ago, long before the PLO was known. It's the type of activity that naturally grows out of the kind of situation that has arisen there and in other parts of the world. It's not peculiar to that area. So I think, coming back, it's the interest of the United States is to settle that, and if it takes the failure or the withdrawal of support of the capacity to wage war, I think that's a very small measure to take.
Well, if I might just answer, it seems to me that we hear a real echo of the past without any regard to the present. For one, the PLO has demonstrated in the Lebanon what it really is, to wit, an extremely disruptive, not just revolutionary, but really anarchic force. They can't even cooperate with Syria, one of the confrontation Arab states, and they can't even tame the PLO so it won't wage an active war today against Christian Lebanese, not against Israelis.
Well, I don't defend the PLO, but to go to a conference which has been agreed upon, that is in general, and get the movement in going that could eradicate the PLO, to make it no longer the kind of organization it is, would be in the interest of Israel as well as ourselves. But you've got to get it. It's a stalemate. As long ago as 75, this same kind of sentiments were being talked about, and Mr. Kissinger, in all his efforts, gave up and said it was hopeless. And he then, at that time, says the intransigence of the Israeli government is too great and we're going to reassess our policy. Of course, he didn't do it because the Congress wouldn't let him. And so they ended up with these piecemeal things, which have been of no particular value, I think. They may or may not. What do you do now under these circumstances? And this is an opportunity, and if you don't get it, I don't see how we can expect this situation to just stay this way indefinitely. There's something bound to give, and it won't be good unless some progress. And I agree with Ms. Rita Hauser. It isn't going to be all done neatly in one package. It's the beginning of the process, the accepting of the principle of withdrawal and the guarantees, which I accept. And we must require the Arabs to do what they've said they do, the responsible leaders have said they would do. And it would take some time, but we'd move in the right direction. Now there's no movement that I can see, none at all. And recently, I thought the reaction of Mr. Begin, who in the face of Carter's, I thought, very polite reception to go back and start two more settlements, it looked as if he was just showing that he doesn't have to bother about him. And if this isn't defiance, the most blatant kind of the U.S. government, I don't know what is. And to continue to subsidize that, it seems to me, is most unusual in the history of modern political life.
But it seems to me, Mr. Fulbright, you had a long experience with subsidizing a government that defied us quite frequently, and we got ourselves in war about it, didn't we? So far, by supporting Israel, we have managed to keep ourselves very effectively out of conflict. Well, I was thinking about Vietnam, but we won't introduce that subject this evening.
Oh, dear me.
By subsidizing Israel, the United States
we'll
has
get in the same situation?
No, to the contrary. To the contrary. My point was absolutely to the contrary. By subsidizing and supporting a strong Israel, we have been able to keep ourselves out of the area. We have a strong ally whose interests are represented by Israel, and that has been one of the effective pins of our military policy in the region, in addition to our moral commitment and historic support of Israel. What I think is of primary importance is for all of us to try to understand that this government, by giving or withholding, is not going to affect the outcome in the area. I think that's a myth in which, with due respect, you engage and others engage. These countries have wills of their own, and they will use every known means to carry out their policies. We have seen Egypt, for example, a minion of Russia, drop Russia, come to the United States. It plays the game as it sees it. The Israelis will play the game as they see it. Our interest should be not to press, force, or otherwise induce them to accept a settlement that we've preconceived, but as I said earlier, to take the hard but more modest task of trying to induce them to come to a conference table. And you're not going to induce Israel to a conference table by cutting off military assistance. You're not going to get a peace settlement in this country by doing a, quote, reassessment. I don't have to speak for the Senate since Senator Javits is here, but I would duly say that the reason that reassessment failed is because the American people didn't support it.
Well,
that's why it failed.
Besides which, the reassessment resulted in the most historic move toward peace that the Middle East knows, to wit the Second Sinai Agreement, actually restoring major areas of the Sinai, including the oil fields, to Egypt. So one can't just dismiss the process as hopeless and bankrupt. The fact is that it has worked in that particular instance, and it worked before in the agreements with Syria and in the agreements with Jordan, terminating other wars. But the important point I'd like to make is that we seem to be talking in a dream world. The fact is that the Israeli cabinet has now decided that it's ready to go to Geneva with a unified Arab delegation, even if that delegation has strong PLO sympathizers. But it will not accept representatives of the PLO, and who can blame them, because the PLO still, notwithstanding all the blandishments of getting along well with the United States and with the other rich Arabs and with their Arab brothers, have still got in their fundamental constitution that they want to liquidate and put Israel completely out of business. Now, how on earth can we ask a nation to negotiate with another entity which wills its destruction?
Well, that's, of course, this is what negotiation is always all about. After every war,
but this is during the war, George. It's not after. They will their destruction now. There's no after.
The fact is that when you have a peace conference, you have it between contending factions, each of which would probably like to see the other destroyed in almost every historic situation we've had. I see no particular reason why you shouldn't negotiate with anyone. What you're interested in is what comes out, not what goes in, and this is the important factor. And I think that this is being. Look, we'll get around this problem. There probably will be a Geneva conference. I think that misses the point. I think the real question is, are we going to accomplish anything by getting the parties there? Because in their present mood,
George,
we're not. I mean, they're so far apart that in their stated positions that unless we can begin to bring them closer together, I think a Geneva conference would be a very dangerous enterprise, a very high-risk enterprise.
Failure would be a disaster.
Well, you know, this is an amazing thing. This is what you want more than anything else, and now you don't want it. It's fantastic. You want it more than anything else. You want a peace conference. You want the Israelis there, but you want peace on terms you write. They may not be the right ones, even for our country.
Senator, I don't want a peace conference. I want peace. And they may be quite distinct things. I think if one looks at the history of peace conferences, unless there has been a good deal of preliminary work done, and unless the parties are moving toward one another, to have a peace conference could be a disaster. And I'm saying right now that I certainly think that we ought to keep pressing for a peace conference, but simultaneously, and even more important, we ought to be trying to get the parties to come to grips with one another on the fundamental issues.
Well, the efforts of the administration are really proceeding on both fronts, the procedural issue of Palestinian representation as well as the ultimate substance of an overall settlement.
You don't have to defend this administration. You're not in it.
No, and if I may say, Joe, look what a shambles was made of Carter's effort to do what Mr. Ball wants the Israelis and the Arabs to do, to wit, to have it all laid out on the table, everybody making their concessions, and then all you're going to do is go to Geneva so it's blessed. Now, Carter tried exactly that earlier this year, and all he did was to feed Arab illusions and Israeli fears. And it couldn't have been a worse defeat. Now, you bring the parties there, if I may just finish. You bring the parties there, the Israelis have undertaken to negotiate anything. Settlements, occupied areas or administered areas, every particular issue they have said they're willing to negotiate. And therefore you bring them there and you do your utmost as a mediator, and that's what the United States would be, to negotiate a deal. I believe it can be done. Why in advance say it can't be done unless you have advance agreement, which you were never able to get and which when tried was a disaster?
No, I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm simply saying that if you look at the history of peace conferences, unless the parties are moving in the direction of one another, a peace conference can be a very dangerous thing because it can be the occasion for a dramatic restatement of hard positions by each side and an ultimate breakup, which I think would be disastrous in this situation. Now, all I'm suggesting is that I think that we ought to be doing very hard work, and personally, I think that what President Carter has done up to this point is splendid, and I disagree quite completely with you, Senator, when you suggested it's been not counterproductive. I don't think it has been. I think that for the United States to have put forward the outlines of a position has really refocused it, and I think we're very much closer to getting somewhere than we've been for a very long time.
Well, this business that is stated by the Senator of New York, that they're willing to negotiate everything. I mean, nearly everything's taken place since Mr. Begin's visit would indicate they have no intention of giving up any territory. And what they've done in the West Bank, and they not only actually done, but say they're going to do, it does not indicate they have any intention whatever of ever giving it up. Nobody that intends to do that would continue to make settlements and spend a great deal of money doing it, I wouldn't think. I see nothing indicating any conciliatory attitude, even toward the United States, much less the PLO, by the spokesman of the government in Israel recently, especially since Mr. Begin's visit. Yeah, I see nothing conciliatory.
Well, now let's say something. I'd like.
But what's conciliatory about
that? Well, the fundamental conciliation has just taken place. The agreement to go to Geneva with a unified Arab delegation and start the negotiations for peace with no holds barred, and the point, Senator Fulbright, is including the settlements. And after all, I myself came back from Israel about a year ago, and I said, the fact that they make a settlement doesn't mean that juridically they're going to keep it.
But let's come back to the fundamentals, which Joe Sisko pointed out. We keep forgetting this, George particularly. We have the contour for peace. That's Resolution 242. That calls for secure and recognized boundaries, which the parties are supposed to negotiate between themselves. Why we drift away from that, which is the fundamental bedrock of our policy, is something that baffles me. The reason that the Israelis resist going to a Geneva conference with the PLO is not obviously for their distaste in dealing with a terrorist organization, but the PLO goes representative qua PLO. That's a predetermination that the conference is going to accord them something, that they're going to come out of that conference with a state, a Palestinian state, which presumably they would dominate. That is something Israel is not willing to accept, and I think rightly, because in my view, and you may disagree, it would be the most fundamentally destabilizing fact in the Middle East, as the conflict in Lebanon has shown. Why people have tended to disregard this brutal, bloody, destructive conflict, who caused it and what the forces are that are at play, is also something that mystifies me. We tend to ignore the destructive role of the PLO in it and continue to say the PLO must have a place in making peace in the area. That's why the Israelis resist going to the conference table to PLO, and I think they're right, and I think the American people stand behind that proposition.
Well, I don't think it's at all clear that all the blame in Lebanon is the PLO. The Israelis have been shelling it and have positions in it and so on. I think it's very unclear just who is responsible
That's
for that
not how the
controversy.
war started, Senator Fulbright.
Well,
That's not how it's being fought.
Well, this is not very clear either. From the Israelis' point of view, that's true. I don't know whether it's true or not.
The problem of attaining permanent peace in the Middle East, as you've heard, is monumental. Yet there's a growing conviction that time is now running out. And if peace is to be made and further turmoil in the Middle East to be averted, it must be made in 1977 or 1978. That is why such great effort is being expended now to reconvene the Geneva Conference this year. Even if it is convened, its success is by no means assured. Much depends, apparently, upon two basic developments: Arab recognition of Israel's right to exist and Israel's recognition of a home for the Palestinian people. Now for other ideas and to challenge our panelists, let's get the views of the experts in our audience.
Who wants to raise the first question? Gentleman right here in front.
I'm Hassan Yassin, Director of Saudi Arabian Information Office in Washington. I'd like to address this question to Mrs. Hauser, who seems to know a great deal about the Israeli position. And I'd like to ask her, do you believe that the Israeli government and people are reconciled to the idea of peace and the creation of a state of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza?
I would have to answer that question, just my own opinion, that a large majority of the population are not reconciled to that proposition at this point in time, and for fairly sound security reasons. A state of Palestine state on the West Bank without an elaborate security structure would be a very dangerous phenomenon for Israel, and it's self-evident why that would be the case in terms of the weapons that are in the area. In the long by and by, it may come to pass after a period of normalization in which the region becomes one that is less hostile than it is today, in which the intent of the parties become far more clear in terms of their peaceful intentions. And that's something that I think is an important ingredient in a peace conference, to get to that question after you have dealt with the other open questions of territory with the protagonist states. But if you're asking me as of this time and place, I think a great number of Israelis would be extremely fearful about the creation of a Palestinian state, even if there were American guarantees of one kind or another.
Gentleman in the second row.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Edward Henderson. I'm a former ambassador of Britain to the Arab world, and I served for a long time in the Arab world and also in Israel and in Palestine before. I'm a visitor to your lovely country. I have great admiration for many things here, and especially the stand which your president has on the question of human rights. One thing perplexes me, and I hope the panel can make me go away less disappointed than I think I might be otherwise. Why is the PLO singled out as the only people who cannot represent their own men for people? They are the representatives of Palestine, but they're not allowed to speak for them. And they are made to adhere to 242, but I do not see the same insistence that Israel should adhere to it, because they clearly flout it utterly. But I should like a clarification, if I might, from the panel. Thank you.
Who would like to address that question? Mrs. Hauser?
The PLO has proven itself, in the Lebanon in particular, and certainly vis-a-vis Israel, to be an anarchic, destabilizing force which seeks to overturn the tranquility of the area, not to speak of the safety and security of Israel. It was accepted at the Rabat Conference as the representative of the Palestinian people without any referendum ever placed to the Palestinian people, clearly shoved down the throat of King Hussein, who was not overjoyed at that prospect, since he would be a clear target of the PLO, as they made clear in the famous Black October when they tried to topple him. Their interests are inimical, in a word, with our interests in the area, with the Saudi Arabian interests in the area, with the interests of the Western world, which is a stable region, not susceptible to radicalization. The PLO is the avant-garde of Libya, of Iraq, of Algeria, of all the destabilizing forces in the extreme in the area, and it serves no purpose for us to elevate them. It would do well for us to try to push them down and out of the picture than the opposite.
Further questions? Yes, in the room.
Charles Sills, Middle East Estimates, Department of Defense. I would like to address this to Mrs. Hauser. Mrs. Hauser described Israel as a military asset or ally of the United States, and I would like her to clarify that, if she could, for us as to what she means, because it would appear that this interpretation would be somewhat different than the usual interpretation that we have been transferring arms to Israel in order to promote a balance in the area or to preserve some sort of American leverage in the situation.
Well, I need not say any more, but that has been the stated position of the Pentagon for more than a decade. It has continually pronounced publicly at hearings in the Congress that a strong Israel in the Mediterranean is our strongest defense in the area against penetration by the Russians. And that has been the underlying theory behind which military assistance has been given to Israel.
But if it weren't for Israel, I think the Russians never would have had any opportunity to make a foothold at all, because the Arab countries have never shown any disposition to be receptive, the major ones at least, except in their fear of the Israelis. I believe General Brown did make a statement, which is chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that there was quite a drain upon our military establishment in drawing off some of our best weapons to ship to Israel, some weapons that none of our NATO allies seem to have. But I don't think that is a sound reason for it.
A further question.
Joyce Shube, Office of Senator Joseph Biden of Delaware. I would like to know if there's any general agreement in principle among the panel members that a homeland for the Palestinians would be necessary for a permanent peace, and if so, which area or in which country would you suggest would be both satisfactory to the Palestinians and least threatening to the Israelis?
A homeland for the Palestinians, which the president has himself abandoned now, he's now spoken of an entity, rather than a homeland, presupposes the lack of a homeland, or the absence of an area which is secure and settleable by Palestinian Arabs. But the fact is that hundreds of thousands have been dispersed throughout the Arab world, that the Arab world is enormous, with a huge population, that Jordan is a country too, in which there are several 100,000 of the Palestinian Arabs, and that the barrier, the only barrier that's arisen, is this tenacious political clinging to the refugee camps on the theory that that will be the greatest platform from which to get back into Israel in terms of conquest. Really, that's what's happened. So the Palestinian homeland idea is a homeland for what and for whom? If you had a people that's homeless and incapable of being settled anywhere, like the Jews, then there was a reason for a homeland, after especially the Holocaust and the persecution of Hitler. But the homeland here is simply a creation of the desire to have a political state in which the PLO chieftains can be the principal political officers. That's all it really comes down to. Let us not forget that Israel can be cut in two in the twinkling of an eye if you do what the PLO wants, which is to establish their state within the territory of the West Bank. Just cut it, it's 8 to 12 miles, and it's cut in two. The Israelis have a right to be mortally afraid of that, especially from an entity, to wit the PLO, which has caused such anarchy and havoc in the Lebanon. And let's not forget that. That isn't words, that isn't descriptions, that isn't Arafat being a moderate, that's death and destruction every day for months on end, and unremitting and unforgiving. I mean, that's what the Israelis have to look forward to. And you've got to understand that as far as they're concerned.
George Ball?
Well, I think that one can't escape the fact that there are something like 1,100,000 Arabs in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. If we talk about giving them an area in which they can exercise the right of self-determination, which seems to be quite fundamental in the American credo, which I suppose is one of the things that human rights is all about, then I would suppose that we have to give them the chance to stay there. There are 3,000 Israeli in the West Bank as against 1,100,000 Arabs. Now, I can't envisage a transfer of population to someplace else, so that the question is, how do they obtain the right of self-determination in in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. All the indications are that if the people were permitted to a right to exercise self-determination, they would choose the PLO as their representatives. This has certainly been what the local elections have suggested, where very recent local elections have been overwhelmingly on the PLO side. So it doesn't seem to me that we're talking about people who shouldn't have a right to a homeland. They're there. There are 1,100,000 of them there. And I don't know what the disposition of them would be otherwise. Certainly to let them stay under a military occupation where they've been for a decade seems to me to be quite contrary to all the principles which this country has represented.
Additional questions? Yes.
Ed Rosenbaum, the Middle East Studies Association of North America. I wanted to ask a question directly about the issue of compromise, especially toward the PLO. The history of the Palestinian Arab nationalist movement has shown that at various crucial times in the past, the PLO or its ancestor organizations have been unwilling to compromise at points at which compromise might have been advantageous to them. I'd like to ask the members of the panel why they believe that the upcoming Geneva conference, if it does happen, will be an opportunity for them to change this pattern of theirs.
I think that the real hope for a flexible, moderate, sensible Arab position is going to come from the major Arab frontline states, and very particularly from the Saudi Arabians. And I think that because they are the control of the money supply of the area, are in a very strong position to bring about a moderate general Arab attitude. And this is what's going to happen as far as the PLO is concerned.
I think a footnote to that is if you could ever get this settlement, even though it takes time, as Senator Javits says, to settlement, that people like the Saudis are so concerned about, we'll call it radicalization and trouble, that they would be most forthcoming in all areas there to try to settle it down. They do have the means, and their first priority is to get peace in the area. And I agree with what you said.
Well, may I say, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Moderator, that I think that's why I perhaps expressed a little more optimism here earlier and throughout, because I do believe that the forces in the Arab world and in the Israeli world are developing toward that end. I don't agree with the conclusion that the Begin will do nothing and that he's uncompromising and that he's still got Samaria and Judea on his mind, including Jordan. Well, maybe he's a very good negotiator, Bill, and gives that impression. But the exigencies, in my judgment, are such that getting the parties going on the peace process will develop these ideas which we've been discussing.
Yes.
Emil Nackley, Professor of Political Science at Mount St. Mary's. I just returned from the West Bank, and since the issue of representation has figured highly in this discussion, I would like to ask Mrs. Hauser to explain her strong rejection of the PLO as a representative of the Palestinians in the light of the following 5 facts. 1, last year's election in the West Bank indicated a strong support.
Please make it brief, please.
A strong support for PLO. 2, Israel has so far failed in developing any new leadership on the West Bank other than PLO. 3, every academic study done by the Hebrew University and the University of Haifa and the West Bank indicated that a majority of the West Bank Arabs indicated in the study that they look at PLO as their representative. 4, every study conducted among Arabs, Palestinian Arabs in Israel itself indicated that the majority views PLO as their representative. And 5th, the most recent statement by West Bank mayors, especially Nablus, Ramallah, and Hebron, indicated that PLO is their representative.
Well, I think we have answered that throughout the course of this discussion. There has never been a free and open plebiscite among Palestinians on the West Bank and elsewhere as to who their representatives should be. The fact is, at Rabat, and I'm sure you all remember it, that decision was taken at the insistence of the more radical Arab countries. King Hussein was most unhappy with the decision. He has not quite accustomed himself to it, seeks every opportunity to get out from it, as do some of the other Arab countries. What is important, very much so, is that the conference unfold without prejudging that question. Because if you ask the PLO to the conference as a representative of the Palestinian people, you have prejudged the single most difficult question that is to be faced by the peace conference. And that prejudgment, I feel confident in saying, Israel will not accept. And I would like to believe that our own government will not urge that solution upon Israel under any set of circumstances. Now, if the PLO would like to accommodate the world and renounce its covenant, which it refused to do just very recently, give up its covenant in which it swears to the destruction of Israel, maybe the whole world would take a very different attitude about it.
I noted that a number of members this evening have alluded indirectly to the Soviet role in the Middle East. How do the panelists view the Soviet role at a renewed Geneva conference and in this whole peace process? George Ball, do you want to comment on that?
I think it's impossible to be very categorical about it. My feeling is, however, that if they're given a role to play in making peace, they would rather see peace in the area than the great risks to them of further turbulence.
I agree with that, and I think we recall it was just a few years ago that Gromyko publicly stated they would join in a joint guarantee of the area, and I think they've given every indication to do that.
My own judgment about it is that the Soviet Union enjoys targets of opportunity, and I believe the vindication of U.S. policy so far is that we are the principal factor there, and I hope we remain that, and that we don't give the Soviet Union the necessity for making a choice, because considering its backing of Libya and its backing of Iraq, I'd be very worried, and its backing of the PLO, I'd be very worried about that choice and whether it will again choose, as it has in Africa and in many other places, to fish in troubled waters. So I would hope very much that the situation remains as it is, and that the United States so intelligently uses the paramountcy of its position that the Soviet Union is necessarily satisfied with this kind of accompanying role.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes another public policy forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of the American Enterprise Institute, I wish to thank our distinguished panelists, Senator Javits, Mr. Fulbright, Mr. Ball, and Mrs. Hauser, and also the experts, members of the press, and our guests here this evening who have participated so actively.
This public policy forum on prospects for peace in the Middle East has brought you the views of 4 leading experts. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.